If you've been on Twitter in the past few days, you've probably seen at least a screenshot or something along the lines of this. This is an image that was on the Pro Football Focus Twitter page, which is a quote from Ben Roethlisberger, which says, "You don't fear him just sitting in the pocket and picking you apart." Wow, that seems very tough, right? What are you doing? Why are you talking smack about Lamar Jackson? What's going on, Ben? Of course, the Steelers and Ravens have their own rivalry. Roethlisberger not exactly known for being a likable player at times, but I think what's really interesting here is how badly I think he's gotten taken out of context here. I want to show the full clip. It's about 25 seconds, but I think it's important to show. But also before this, I just want to explain what they're talking about. They're talking about the addition of Odell. And first, Roethlisberger said it was interesting how we don't even know if Lamar's going to be there, but then he's going to talk about what Odell brings to the offense. So it's not a Lamar Jackson conversation. That's important to note. It is a Odell conversation.
With Lamar, you want to bring safeties down to help stop the run because you don't really fear Lamar's arm. His accuracy all the time.
Sure.
He's got a huge arm. He can make things happen when he scrambles and whatever, but you don't fear him just sitting in the pocket and picking you apart.
Sure.
So you can bring safeties down because you do fear him running because he's a different level runner. So you fear that. Yeah. So you bring safeties down. But now, if you got that guy on the outside, you better put a safety back or it's one-on-one. You can just throw it to him.
For me, with that context, listen, you can still consider it a negative. You can still consider it a insult to Lamar if you want to, but it's certainly a lot different than what I think that it's getting presented as he's saying. Like Robert Griffin III, who also, has a media job, had this to say. He said, Ben Roethlisberger on Lamar Jackson, you don't fear him sitting in the pocket and picking you apart. Teams fear, and then Griffin himself says, teams fear Lamar the runner more than the passer, but don't use that to tear him down. For example, Lamar's career passer rating and QBR in the pocket is better than Big Ben. To me, this is a very poor point for several reasons. For one thing, Griffin's quote was, teams fear Lamar the runner more than the passer, but don't use that to tear him down. That's pretty much what Big Ben said. He said, okay, teams don't really fear him as a passer, they fear him as a runner. That's the way that they view it. Okay, it's a little bit harsher than Griffin has phrased it, but that's really the main thing that is different is the phrasing. Again, Roethlisberger taking it from a defensive strategy. What do you do to defend against Lamar? You don't fear him as a passer, you fear him as a runner, which is, even as a huge Lamar Jackson fan, which I am, that's still objectively a true thing that teams do. And he's not using it to tear Lamar down. He's using it to bring up why adding Odell would be so much of a benefit to the team. And I think that's kind of the issue, is people are assuming this was a conversation about Lamar and his contract when it absolutely wasn't. The other thing that Griffin says that doesn't really make any sense, and this is a lesser point, but I heard it getting brought up a ton, so I'll bring it up, is Lamar Jackson's career passer rating and QBR inside the pocket, that being better than Big Ben's, which is, flawed for several reasons. The first of which is, most people's passer rating is worse than Lamar Jackson's that talk about him. Mine would certainly be worse if I was in the NFL. Does that mean I can't have an opinion on Lamar Jackson? Roethlisberger, again, not using it to tear Lamar down, but even if he was, he's allowed to criticize players who are better than him. I'm sure Robert Griffin III, in his job, has criticized players who were better than him in the NFL. That's okay. That's allowed. Also, the obvious point, which is it's incredibly misleading because part of why Lamar Jackson's stats are good inside the pocket is because A, it's easier to throw today than it was 20 years ago, and B, because teams fear him in the pocket, it's easier to throw. And again, I say this as a huge Lamar Jackson fan. I think the Ravens should have paid him. I think he's a fringe top 5 quarterback in the NFL right now. I've always been a huge Lamar fan. If you follow this channel, you're well aware of that. But that doesn't mean that you can't criticize the guy or simply just talk about how teams will defend against him, which I think is fair to say. So, I don't know. To me, this quote didn't seem that bad, but people really harped on it and kind of, again, used it to, I feel like, made Big Ben kind of the boogeyman in a sense, because he is a former Steeler, he is an unlikable player, so they use him as a boogeyman to kind of, create an enemy so that way they can rail against him in the media, in the sports media, which is, becoming more and more of a joke, let's be honest. I mean, let's just take the way that it was on Undisputed with Skip and Shannon, which, listen, I get it. But still, a lot of people watch it. A lot of people do get their sports news from it. Let's look at how they phrased this question.
Ben Roethlisberger discussed Lamar Jackson's situation on his latest podcast. Woo.
So right off the bat, I'm going to pause it right here just to show that, again, phrasing it wrong, just straight up incorrectly telling the story, saying that he's talking about the Lamar Jackson situation heavily implies, if not just straight up says, that, I would say straight up says that they're talking about Lamar's contract when that was not at all what they were talking about. They were talking about the Odell thing. So already an important distinction to make, I think. But anyways, moving on.
Big Ben had a pretty harsh critique of the Ravens QB. He said, quote, "You don't really fear Lamar's arm, his accuracy all the time. You don't fear him sitting in the pocket and picking you apart." Whew, Shannon, what's your reaction to Big Ben's comments?
Which, again, it's so much harsher than the way that Roethlisberger revealed the quote. It's not necessarily wrong. He did say that, but again, kind of, there's an old expression that anything that comes before a but in a sentence doesn't matter. And he doesn't actually say the word but he does say, you don't fear this about Lamar. What you do fear is this. It's not necessarily an insult of Lamar's game. It's saying he has strengths and weaknesses. These are what his strengths are. These are what his weaknesses are. In the media, in this case, Undisputed, is only saying, and it's been in a lot of places, not just Fox News, but they're only talking about when he brought up the negatives, which makes it imply he's much more negative on Lamar than he actually is. And I think the phrasing is very just wrong, in my opinion. That entire segment is actually pretty funny because they bring up things that Roethlisberger talks about. I mean, at one point, Shannon Sharp says that, makes an analogy and says that, well, if you don't really fear a bear, you just fear its teeth. It's like, well, you feared a bear then. But that's not what Roethlisberger is saying. He's not saying you don't fear Lamar Jackson. He's simply just talking about it, which if you watch the whole clip of him, you would notice that. Shannon Sharp also then goes on to compare Ben Roethlisberger and Lamar Jackson, bringing up that Lamar Jackson has no receivers, which is literally the whole point of what Roethlisberger's entire segment was about, or entire clip was about, was that typically the Ravens don't have receivers. Now that they have a receiver, you will fear Lamar in the pocket more. Like, that's his entire point, which is getting used against him here in a really just bizarre way. But again, not knowing the context, if you just know that intro, well then yeah, you're going to think that Roethlisberger just being a salty old man who's insulting a former rival of his, which is, just not what's happening. And I think my favorite quote from that segment is the following.
I just don't get what was his, and I get it, Skip. Maybe his podcast, and sometimes you have to say things like this, like, oh, okay, Ben said this. Okay, let me go here. Let me go watch his podcast. Yeah. Let me see what else he said. Make sure I'm not hearing him out of context.
Yeah. I mean, it's just incredible stuff. I mean, it's literally like, yes, this is out of context. Yes, it absolutely is. I'm not saying you can't still have a problem with the take if you want to. If you want to say, no, actually, teams should fear him as a passer and as a runner. But I think that part of why his passing is good is because of what it's... I think he's a fine passer. Again, I think Lamar would be in the NFL if he had the athleticism of Kirk Cousins. I do. But definitely what teams fear when they look at Lamar is Lamar as a runner, and that's what Roethlisberger was saying. So agree with Roethlisberger, disagree with Roethlisberger, but clearly the take of, I think Odell is going to help them because teams don't really fear Lamar as a runner. They don't really fear Lamar as a passer. They fear Lamar as a runner, and so having Odell will then make them a more complete offense is a very different take than talking about the Lamar situation. Teams don't really fear Lamar as a passer. End of sentence. That's a lot harsher, and clearly a lot harsher, and intentionally so, because they're trying to get a story out of it. And I used the Fox Sports Undisputed thing as an example, which, I just needed one example for the video. I can't, show too many, although I used a few extras, but, I don't want to make the whole video about 7 different things. But this was all over. There were people I respect. Like, I like PFF. I think they're pretty good. Why aren't they doing their research? A lot of stuff where you're just trying to drive clicks, drive attention. It's not what he said, and it's just frustrating, I think, because, I don't know, this is why people don't trust anyone in the media anymore, is because people don't do their research even on small levels, and it becomes this huge thing. It's like, it's not that difficult to do, and I don't get why we don't do this more often and fact check it, which is why I'm trying to and hopefully helping set the record straight, because I think a lot of people view, hey, it's a big Ben Roethlisberger quote, who cares? But this causes people to now not trust when like reputable sources say things, because they'll remember, well, what about the Ben Roethlisberger quote that was out of context? Can't trust anybody. That's where things get frustrating. So listen, it happens, mistakes get made, I get it, but it's very frustrating how many of these big corporations and reputable sources, reputable organizations that have plenty of people who can fact check this stuff are making a conscious choice not to. That's at least how I view it. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.